So the Canadian government has just awarded a former child soldier, Omar Khadr, $10.5 million for human rights violations by the Canadian government. So first I'm going to break down a little backstory so you understand exactly what happened. July 27th will mark the 15-year anniversary of the firefight in Afghanistan, during which Khadr, at the age of 15, was shot and captured, and U.S. Delta Force soldier Sergeant First Class Christopher Spear was fatally wounded. Omar's father, Ahmed Saeed Khadr, took him, an 8-year-old boy, from Canada to Afghanistan and Pakistan, and the U.S. military, who, instead of treating him as a child soldier, detained, tortured, and subjected him to an unfair trial. And Canada, which under Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin's Liberals and Stephen Harper's Conservatives, abandoned him in the illegal hellhole that is Guantanamo Bay. So after spending several years in Guantanamo Bay, he was sent back to Canada where his case was finally heard. The Supreme Court of Canada ruled in favor of Khadr 3 times after his lawyers took the case to court. And in 2010, it unequivocally stated that Canadian officials had violated Khadr's human rights under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and that his treatment offends the most basic Canadian standards about the treatment of detained youth suspects. And Khadr remains the only captive the US has prosecuted for murder under the Military Commissions Act. So once you hear all the details, the $10.5 million settlement starts to make more sense. Here's a guy who grew up in Canada, then was brought to Afghanistan by his father, who was a terrorist. Then he was captured by the US, and instead of being treated as a Canadian citizen, his human rights were violated in Guantanamo Bay. And you'd think, considering how open-minded Canadians tend to be, that they would be more open to understanding this case. But they're not. In fact, in a recent Angus Reid poll, 71% of Canadians oppose this, claiming the Trudeau government did the wrong thing. It should have fought the case and left it to the courts to decide whether Khadr was wrongfully imprisoned. But in a minute, I'm going to show you how many Canadians are actually aware of the details of this case, because the reality is, the Canadian government has fought this case. Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale noted that the government had spent nearly $5 million in legal fees unsuccessfully fighting 3 Khadr cases all the way to the Supreme Court, and this cost to taxpayers would continue with virtually no chance of success, and the possibility of an even larger payout. So that 71% number of Canadians that are against this shows how many Canadians don't actually know what the reality is. And in fact, in that same Angus Reid poll, it breaks down how many people really don't know what they're talking about. In another poll question in that same poll, Angus Reid asked, thinking about Omar Khadr's overall story during these past 15 years, based on whatever you have seen or read about it and on your own general impressions, would you say he was ultimately treated fairly or unfairly? And the highest result, 42%, are unsure what his story is actually about. So once you have that full context, you begin to understand why 71% of Canadians are against it. It's because a lot of them don't actually know the details of the case, and it's more likely that they saw the name Omar and the word terrorist and thought, no, I don't think a guy named Omar who's a terrorist deserves $10.5 million. And that is the extent of their thinking. But when you actually look into the case and see that his human rights were violated by the Canadian government, you begin to understand why the government settled. But instead of the Canadian media focusing on the reality that most people don't know the details of this case, what number do you think they focused on? Global News, Omar Khadr payout. 71% of Canadians say government made the wrong call. National Post, John Ivison. 71% of Canadians say Liberals were wrong to settle with Omar Khadr. CBC News, majority of Canadians oppose Omar Khadr's settlement, poll suggests. So this is exactly where the media fails. Instead of informing Canadians that, you know what, maybe you guys don't know the details of this case, they instead decide to focus on the flashy number. 71% of Canadians oppose, instead of actually getting into the real details and focusing on the fact that most Canadians don't really understand what the hell they're talking about, but decide to oppose something anyways. So once you actually understand the details of this case and understand that Omar Khadr's human rights were violated, then you begin to understand that, yes, a $10.5 million settlement by the Canadian government makes sense.